In the night of the 23rd of April 1951, the Chinese forces attacking the Australian positions on Hill 504 were so close that the captain commanding B Company did something that no artillery manual prescribes as safe. He called fire at 50 metres from his own men. The heat from the explosions burned the faces of the Australians in their trenches. And it worked. I spent weeks going through AWM archives, the Anzac portal, and veteran testimonies from 3 RAR to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear happened in a corridor less than 7 kilometres wide in the hills of Korea. And it saved Seoul. The Kapyong Valley, Gapyeong County, Gyeonggi Province, 60 kilometres northeast of Seoul. A natural corridor flanked by steep hills dominating all the surrounding terrain, less than 7 kilometres wide at its narrowest point. The Pukan River, running through the centre approximately 3 kilometres wide, provided exactly the kind of access a Chinese division needed to move quickly toward the capital. In any other context, just another valley in the Korean mountains. In April 1951, the direct route to the South Korean capital, Seoul had already fallen to communist forces twice. In June 1950, when the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel and the South Korean capital was taken in days. In January 1951, when Chinese intervention pushed UN forces back south and Seoul fell for the second time, the objective of the Chinese spring offensive of April 1951 was clear: recapture Seoul for the third time, demonstrate that Chinese intervention could keep pushing south, that UN forces couldn't hold the capital, that the war on the Korean peninsula had an inevitable outcome. And the most direct route towards Seoul from the northeast ran through the Kapyong Valley. If Kapyong fell, the road to Seoul was open. The crisis at Kapyong didn't start with the attack on the Australian positions. It started a day earlier, with the collapse of the 6th South Korean Division. On the 22nd of April, Chinese 19 Corps destroyed the 6th ROK Division. Didn't force it to retreat in an orderly fashion, destroyed it as a fighting unit, and the South Korean forces that survived the collapse needed an escape route. The Kapyong Valley was that route. The same corridor where the Chinese 118th Division was advancing. The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was called from reserve specifically to block that route. To place itself between the Chinese 118th Division and the Kapyong corridor, to buy the time the retreating South Korean forces needed to escape, and to prevent the corridor from becoming the highway towards Seoul that the Chinese planners had in mind. 2,800 Commonwealth soldiers against 10,600 Chinese. The 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RA, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson. Approximately 700 Australians in positions on Hill 504, with the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, on Hill 677 to the north. 2,800 Allied soldiers in total, against the Chinese 118th Division, 10,600 men. The Australians were outnumbered at least 4-1, possibly more. Ferguson assessed the situation with the clarity of a commander who knows exactly what he has to do and exactly how much it's going to cost to do it. His men were going to hold that hill. Not because there was a better tactical option, but because if they didn't hold, the Kapyong corridor was open. And if the Kapyong corridor was open, the Chinese 118th Division would reach Seoul with nothing to stop it. Just after midnight on the 23rd of April, 1951, Corporal Blue Murray and his section of B Company were the first Australians to make contact. The Chinese were attacking from the north. 2 Chinese battalions hit B and C companies of 3 RAR simultaneously. Not a reconnaissance probe, not a sounding to assess Australian positions. A mass assault designed to overwhelm the positions before Allied artillery could respond effectively in the darkness. What followed in the next hours is what the Australian archives describe with an economy of language that says more than the words fully capture. Hand-to-hand combat with grenades, bayonets and close-quarters fighting. The Australians attacked repeatedly over their own dead and wounded throughout the night. Not because the manual prescribed it, because it was the only way to hold a position that couldn't be lost. And while B and C companies absorbed the main attacks, an additional Chinese battalion hit the battalion headquarters, forcing it to withdraw. Contact with superior command was lost throughout the night. The battalion was considered annihilated. In some point of that night, Captain Darcy Laughlin of B Company made a decision that the Anzac portal archives document with enough precision to understand exactly what it meant. He requested artillery fire at 50 meters from his own position, not 200 meters, not 100 meters, 50 meters. The distance at which the heat from explosions burns the faces of men in their trenches, on the positions where the American tanks had been, directly in front of his company, positions the Chinese had taken and from which they threatened the Australian flank with fire that could disintegrate B Company before dawn. The 16th New Zealand Field Artillery Regiment received the coordinates and fired. The 25-pound shells arrived on the positions in front of B Company. At 50 meters from the Australians in their trenches, not the pressure wave from a distant explosion, the heat from detonations at 50 meters burned the faces of the men in the Australian trenches. Men who were covered enough to survive the explosions, not far enough away not to feel what those explosions produced at that distance. And the Chinese in the positions in front of B Company, those who had taken the American tank positions, those who were in open ground when the New Zealand fire arrived, didn't have 1.5 meter deep trenches to shelter in. They were exposed. The fire at 50 meters that burned the faces of the Australians destroyed the Chinese, threatening the flank. No Australian casualties from friendly fire. Laughlin's decision, the distance that no artillery manual would have prescribed as safe, was exactly the right decision. To understand why Laughlin could make that decision, why he didn't hesitate to call fire at 50 meters from his own men, you need to understand something about the Australian officers who fought in Korea. They weren't men who followed protocol when protocol didn't serve. They were men who assessed the situation in front of them and did what the situation required. The same tradition that had produced the private of the 2/13th Battalion who told the British general exactly where he could go with his order to lower the Australian flag. The same tradition that had produced Arnold Potts executing the elastic retreat at Kokoda while they called him a coward from Brisbane. The same tradition that had produced Vasey fighting his war in the Buna Swamp while MacArthur demanded frontal attacks from Brisbane. An Australian officer in combat made the decision the situation required. Not the decision the manual prescribed. Not the decision someone far from the terrain would have made. The terrain decision. And in the early hours of the 24th of April, 1951, on a hill in Korea, the terrain decision was clear. Fire at 50 meters. Or the Australian flank gave way. Laughlin chose the fire. At 4 in the morning of the 24th of April, D Company on the summit of Hill 504 was probed. Approximately 6 Chinese soldiers approaching their position to assess the defence. 6. While B and C companies had been absorbing attacks from 2 full Chinese battalions for hours, when dawn arrived on the 24th of April, Ferguson assessed what he had. B Company in an unsustainable position after the night of combat. Communications with superior command cut for hours. A second Chinese regiment deploying for the next attack. And his men, those who had survived the night with grenades and bayonets and artillery fire at 50 meters from their trenches, exhausted but in position. At some point on the 24th of April, 3 RAR was effectively surrounded, without a land resupply route, with ammunition running out, without time for food. The presidential unit citation that 3 RAR received from the United States documents it with a phrase that AWM archives preserve with the precision of a formal recognition. Ammunition ran low and there was no time for food. Critical supplies were dropped by air to the encircled troops, and they stood their ground in resolute defiance of the enemy. They didn't retreat. They didn't request extraction. They requested resupply. And kept holding. At 7:30 in the evening, with the position consolidated and the next tactical move clear, Ferguson ordered the organised withdrawal. The companies fell back through D Company, the last to leave Hill 504 and 3 RAR deployed within the 1st Marine Regiment's position, with 32 dead, 59 wounded, 3 captured, and more than 500 Chinese dead counted in the Australian sector alone. The Kapyong corridor remained in Allied hands. Seoul remained safe. If this story is pulling you in, now is the time to subscribe to the channel. Every week we publish documentaries about the Australian military stories that history books don't tell. One click. And you won't miss any of them. If 3 RA had yielded its position on Hill 504, the entire brigade's flank was exposed. Not just the Australian sector. The entire brigade. If the Australian position gave way, the Canadian position on Hill 677 was flanked. If both positions gave way, the 27th Brigade was vulnerable to encirclement and annihilation. If the brigade was annihilated, the Kapyong corridor was completely open. And if the Kapyong corridor was open, with the momentum the Chinese 118th Division had brought from destroying the 6th South Korean Division, the next significant defensive position before Seoul required time to organise that UN forces didn't have, Seoul, for the 3rd time. In the context of armistice negotiations already being discussed, in the context of a war where the territory controlled when the ceasefire came determined the terms of the agreement, the fall of Seoul for the 3rd time wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a political defeat with consequences that Allied planners preferred not to calculate in detail. The Presidential Unit Citation that the United States awarded 3 RAR on the 23rd of June, 1951, uses words that formal recognitions rarely use with that precision. Of inestimable importance. Extraordinary heroism. Resolute defiance of the enemy. Lieutenant General Scott Winter, Deputy Commander of the United Nations Command, articulated it with the clarity of someone who has assessed what Kapyong meant for everything that came after. The UNC and all the nations that fought under its banner remain indebted to these veterans, whose service demonstrated a selfless dedication to freedom and democracy on the Korean peninsula. The military historians who have studied the Korean War describe Kapyong as the most famous and significant action fought by the Canadian and Australian armies in that conflict. An impressive achievement that helped prevent a potentially costly defeat for South Korean and UN forces. And the Australian wing commander connected it to something longer than the battle itself. The heroic efforts at Kapyong were not in vain. The success of the UN Command's mission during the war laid the foundations for the eventual transformation of South Korea into the prosperous democratic nation it is today. A prosperous democratic nation, built on, among other things, what happened on a hill in the Kapyong Valley on the 23rd and 24th of April 1951, when 700 Australians decided they weren't going to move. Even though the numbers said they should, Bruce Ferguson commanded 3 RAR at Kapyong with the clarity of a commander who understood exactly what he had and exactly what he was being asked to do with it. 700 Australians against more than 10,000 Chinese, in a corridor that couldn't be lost. During the night of the 23rd to the 24th of April, Ferguson coordinated a defence that the infantry manual wouldn't have prescribed in exactly that way, because the infantry manual hadn't anticipated exactly that situation. Companies simultaneously attacked from multiple directions. Battalion headquarters displaced by an additional attack, communications with superior command cut for hours, and Ferguson making decisions in real time without the information a battalion commander is normally expected to have when making decisions of that type, with the results the archives document. The battalion held. Corporal Blue Murray and his section of B Company were the first Australians to make contact with the Chinese. Just after midnight on the 23rd of April, the Chinese were attacking from the north, and Murray and his men held their position under the initial fire of an attack the archives describe as 2 full Chinese battalions launched simultaneously against B and C companies. Captain Darcy Laughlin of B Company, the man who called artillery fire at 50 metres from his own men, who felt the heat of those explosions from his trench, who saw that it worked, and who kept B Company in position during a night that Superior Command believed had annihilated the entire battalion. Lieutenant Jimmy Young of 6th Platoon. The AWM photographs taken on the 24th of April 1951 show him taking Chinese prisoners on Hill 504. Not a man who survived the night hidden in his trench. A man who at dawn was taking prisoners. With Sergeant Morris beside him. Private Kenneth Turton Matchett was in 4 Platoon of B Company. He was from Strathfield, New South Wales. He died in action on the 24th of April 1951. One of the 32 Australians who didn't come back from Hill 504. 32 dead, 59 wounded, 3 captured. Numbers that in the language of operational reports are statistics. In the language of the families of Strathfield and all the other Australian towns and cities where those men had grown up, they are something completely different. There was no Victoria Cross for any Australian at Kapyong. What there was something that no Australian unit had received before, and that few foreign units received from the United States. The Presidential Unit Citation. On the 23rd of June, 1951 3 RAR received the highest decoration the American Army can award to a foreign unit. The first time in history it had been awarded to an Australian unit. It has only happened a second time since. When D Company of 6 RAR received the same distinction for the Battle of Long Tan in Vietnam on the 18th of August 1966, twice in all of Australian history. Kapyong was the first. The battle honour Kapyong is carried in 3 RAR's colours to this day. The first battle honour awarded to the regiment, and the soldiers who carry those colours today know exactly what that first honour cost. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War. Not just in Australia, in every country that participated. It happened between the Second World War and Vietnam, and in the space between 2 wars that filled all historical attention, Korea remained as a conflict that ended without a clear victory. And Kapyong, an extraordinary battle within that forgotten war, was buried within what was already buried. Except in one place. Within 3 RAR, Kapyong was never forgotten. The current soldiers of the battalion articulate it with a precision that says more than any historical analysis. It's more of a challenge to live up to the reputation our predecessors created. There is a saying that the Korean War is the forgotten war, but not in the 3 RAR. It will never be forgotten. Australia officially commemorates Kapyong Day every year between the 23rd and 25th of April. Not with the scale of Anzac Day. With the precision of a country that knows some of its soldiers fought battles that most of its citizens don't remember, and that decides those soldiers deserve someone to remember them anyway. In 2026, for the 75th anniversary, a contingent of Australian soldiers, predominantly from 3 RAR in Townsville, travelled to South Korea. The ceremony was held on the 24th of April at the Australian and New Zealand Kapyong Memorial in Gapyeong. Veterans from Australia, Canada and New Zealand, some returning to the ground where they had fought as young men, to the same valley, the same hills, where 75 years earlier they had decided they weren't going to move. The Royal Australian Mint issued a commemorative 50-cent coin for that anniversary, with wattle and 32 poppies. One for each of the 32 Australians who died on Hill 504. 32 poppies on a 50-cent coin, because there are ways of remembering that don't need words. Mick Servos was a 3 RAR veteran in Korea. He was wounded at Kapyong, and decades later, when analyses and history books kept treating the Korean War as the Forgotten War, Mick Servos personally initiated the Royal Australian Regiment National Memorial Walk. Not because anyone asked him to, not because an institution funded it, but because a man who had been on that hill, who had seen what happened there, who knew exactly what the battle honour Kapyong in 3 RAR's colours meant in terms of Australian bodies and Australian decisions and artillery fire. At 50 metres, that man decided that future generations needed to know. and built something so they would, Old Faithful. Not a nickname that a general assigned after the battle. A name that emerged from the men themselves and that the battalion has carried since then as what it is. Not a title. A promise that when the work has to be done, 3 RAR will be there, with whatever numbers it has, on whatever terrain it gets. And it will hold. There's something about this story that the numbers don't fully capture. Not the 32 dead, not the more than 500 Chinese dead in the Australian sector, not the presidential unit citation or the battle honour in 3 RAR's colours. It's this. An Australian captain called artillery fire at 50 metres from his own men. The heat from the explosions burned the faces of the Australians in their trenches. And it worked. And when the battalion was surrounded, without ammunition, without food, with communications to superior command cut and headquarters displaced, they requested an airdrop. And kept holding. Not because the manual said they could, but because the Kapyong corridor couldn't be lost, and 3 RA was the only one there to prevent it. Old Faithful, who never forgot what happened on that hill, and who carries 32 poppies in its colours to remember those who didn't come back to tell it. If this channel is telling you stories you haven't heard before, subscribe now. We're a small channel, building something big. Every subscriber matters, and the next documentary is already ready. There's another story just as buried as this one. Another battalion that held what the numbers said it couldn't hold, in different terrain. With a decision just as impossible as the one Darcy Laughlin made in the darkness of Hill 504, it's in the next video.